The text message came in at 11:14 on a Tuesday morning, while I was scraping ice off the windshield of my truck in the driveway. I remember because I'd just been thinking about how I needed to get the tires switched over before the first real snowfall hit, and my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, and I thought it was my buddy Roger calling about hockey tickets. It wasn't Roger. It was my son. "Dad, we need to talk. Hazel doesn't want you at the graduation dinner. I know this is hard to hear, but she says things get tense when you're around and she wants the evening to be peaceful." We hope you understand. I stood there with the ice scraper in my hand for a long time. 31 years I spent in that house. 31 years of early mornings and late nights, and every school concert, and every hockey practice, and every time my son called at 2 a.m. because his car wouldn't start somewhere on the 401. I got up and I went. I didn't ask questions. That's what fathers do. And now his wife didn't want me at his graduation dinner. I put the phone back in my pocket. I finished scraping the windshield. I got in the truck and I drove to the hardware store because I needed weather stripping for the garage door, and life doesn't stop because your heart does. But I'll get to all of that. You need to understand who my son is and who I am before any of this makes sense. My name is Clifford. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago after 35 years working as an electrical contractor in the Waterloo region, running my own company for the last 18 of those. I built that company from nothing. A used van, a handful of tools, and a reputation for showing up on time and doing the job right. By the time I sold it, we had 14 employees and contracts with 3 of the largest commercial developers in the region. My wife passed when our son Liam was 9 years old, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend much time on that because even now, 23 years later, it still sits in my chest like a stone. What I will say is that from that point on, it was just the two of us, Liam and me. I was not a perfect father. I worked too much, especially in the early years when the company was struggling and I was terrified of losing everything. There were dinners I missed, and school events I had to leave early. I know that. I've never pretended otherwise, but I was there. I was always fundamentally there. When Liam was 16, I sat him down and we talked about money. Not in a lecture way, in a real way. I showed him my books. I explained what it meant to own a business, what a good month looked like and what a bad month looked like, what debt felt like and what it felt like to pay it down. I wanted him to understand that money was something you built carefully, not something that just appeared. I also opened in respite for him when he was born, and I never stopped contributing to it. By the time he graduated high school, it had grown to just over $90,000. He went to the University of Waterloo for engineering, lived in residence his first year, then rented a house with 3 other guys. I paid his tuition. I made sure he never had to work more than a part-time job so he could focus on school. Was that too much? Maybe. I've thought about that. But I did it because his mother would have wanted him to have every advantage, and because he was my son, and I loved him and I could afford it. He graduated in the spring. Convocation was in June. 5 years of hard work, and he had a job offer from a firm in Kitchener before he even walked across the stage. I was proud of him. I am still proud of him. Whatever happened after, I want to make that clear. He met Hazel in his 3rd year. She was doing a business degree at Laurier. Smart girl, I thought when I first met her. Ambitious. She had opinions about everything, and she didn't hesitate to share them, which I respected even when I disagreed. She came from money. I could tell that much. Her parents had a place in Westmount and another one in Collingwood, and she talked about both of them the way people do when they've never had to think about whether they could afford a place. The first time I noticed something was off was at Thanksgiving, about a year after they started dating. Liam and Hazel came to my place in Cambridge. I'd made a turkey, the full thing, the way I always did. Hazel looked around my kitchen and said very pleasantly, "It's cozy here." The way she said it, though. There was something underneath the word that I couldn't quite name. Like she was cataloging the house, like she was measuring it against something else in her head. I told myself I was being oversensitive. A few months later, Liam mentioned that Hazel's father had offered to connect him with some people in the Toronto finance sector, and that Hazel thought it might be worth exploring opportunities beyond Waterloo. I asked him what he thought. He said he wasn't sure yet. He seemed uncertain in a way I hadn't seen in him for a while. After that, it started to shift. Small things. He called less often. When I did see him, he seemed distracted, like part of him was somewhere else. A few times he said things that sounded like they'd been rehearsed, opinions he'd never held before, phrases that didn't quite fit his voice. Then last Christmas, they came to the house, first time in 2 years for the holidays. I'd put in some effort, got a tree, made his favorite things. At some point after dinner, Hazel said something about how nice it must be to have such a manageable life. No mortgage stress, no corporate pressure, just a simple routine. I looked at her. She smiled. Liam didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either, but I remembered it. Somewhere around February, Liam told me he and Hazel were moving to Toronto after graduation. She'd been offered a position at her father's colleague's firm, and Liam had agreed to explore options there as well. I told him that sounded like an exciting opportunity. I asked if he was happy about it. He said yes. He didn't quite look it. I should tell you something about the finances at this point, because it matters for what came later. When I sold the business 3 years ago, the sale went through a corporate lawyer I'd worked with for 15 years. A man named Gerald. No, wait. I've known my lawyer for a long time. I'll call him my lawyer. He helped me structure the sale so that a significant portion of the proceeds were sheltered through a family trust. The trust named Liam as a beneficiary. It wasn't a secret. I'd told Liam about it years before, but I'd also structured it with conditions that I hadn't fully explained to him. Conditions my lawyer and I had put in place specifically because I'd wanted to make sure any inheritance served Liam's actual well-being and not someone else's agenda. The conditions were private. I hadn't shared the details with anyone. The Tuesday morning of that text message, I'd already been wondering whether to revisit those conditions. After I got home from the hardware store, I called my lawyer. I told him what the text said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you want to make any changes?" I said, "Not yet, but I want to have the paperwork ready. I want to stop here for a moment because I know what some people think when they read a story like this. They think the father is being petty. They think it's about money and power and control. That's not what this was. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't angry. Not really. Not in the way that makes you want to punish someone. What I felt was something quieter and sadder than anger. It was the feeling of recognizing a pattern you'd been trying not to see for 2 years. Hazel didn't dislike me because I'd done something wrong. Hazel disliked me because I was inconvenient, because I was a reminder that Liam came from somewhere, that there was a history before her, a father who knew who he was before she shaped him into something new. I represented a version of Liam that didn't fit the story she was writing, and Liam, my son, who I had scraped ice off windshields for and sat up nights with when he was sick and driven 3 hours in a snowstorm once because he'd locked his keys in his apartment, my son had looked at that text before he sent it. He'd read it. He'd pressed send. That was the part that stayed with me. The graduation dinner was at a restaurant in Yorkville, one of those places with a 4-week wait list and no prices on the menu. Hazel's parents were flying in from Montreal. There was a whole group of Hazel's university friends and colleagues of her father's. It was, as I understood it, designed to be a formal celebration of a certain kind of arrival. And I was not part of that picture. They didn't want me there. But they didn't tell me not to transfer the graduation gift I'd been planning. The gift, for context, I had set aside $50,000 for Liam as a graduation present. Not a whim. Something I'd decided on years before. Money I'd specifically carved out of the trust proceeds for this purpose. A down payment, I'd imagined, on a first home someday, or whatever he wanted it for. It was his. The week after the text, Liam called me. It was a short call. He sounded like he was reading from something. "Dad, I know the dinner thing was hard to hear, but Hazel really needs the evening to be stress-free. You understand, right? It's just about the energy." The energy. "Yeah," I said. "I understand." I didn't argue. I didn't make him feel guilty. I asked how he was doing. He said fine. We talked about the weather for 2 minutes, and then we hung up. That evening, I called my lawyer again. I told him I wanted to make some changes. First, the $50,000 graduation gift would not be transferred as a lump sum. Instead, I restructured it into a separate account that I retained control of, with a provision that it could be released in increments when Liam requested it for a specific verified purpose, a home purchase, a business investment, an emergency medical expense, not for anything else. Not for someone else's restaurant tabs or European vacations or whatever else people spend money on when they suddenly feel wealthy. Second, I reviewed the trust conditions. The original structure had named Liam as sole beneficiary with relatively few strings attached. I added a clause through a codicil that required any disbursement above $25,000 annually to pass through my approval while I was living. It wasn't punitive. It was just a door I could open or close depending on circumstances. Third, and this one was more personal, I updated my own accounts. Hazel was not on them. She never had been. But I'd had Liam listed as a secondary on 2 of my investment accounts for practical reasons. I removed him from those as well, not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed to know that those assets stayed clearly separate while I figured out what kind of relationship we actually had. I did all of this quietly. I told no one. The graduation ceremonies itself was in June. I watched the live stream alone in my living room with a cup of coffee and a piece of the butter tart squares I'd made, his favorite, something his mother used to make. I watched him walk across the stage. I clapped in my living room, which sounds sad, and maybe it was, but it was also just true. He looked happy. He looked like himself for a moment, up there on that stage, and I was glad. I sent him a text, proud of you. Always. He sent back a thumbs up emoji. That was June. August is when things came apart. It started, from what I can piece together, around the time Liam and Hazel were finalizing the lease on a condo in Liberty Village. Nice building, I'd heard. Not cheap. I later learned that Hazel's parents had promised a contribution toward the first and last month's rent, but that the contribution had been delayed for some reason related to the father's firm. In any case, it fell through. Liam called me on a Friday afternoon. He was casual about it at first, asked how I was doing, told me about the new job, which sounded like it was going well. Then he said, "Hey, so we're getting into the condo next month, and we were wondering if we could access some of that graduation fund you mentioned." I said, "Of course. What for?" He said, "Just the move. First, some furniture. Getting set up." I said, "How much are you thinking?" He said, 20, maybe 25? I said, "Okay. Send me the lease and the move-in date, and I'll set up the transfer." He paused. "The lease?" "Just the lease agreement," I said. "I restructured the fund a few months back. It's tied to verified purposes now. I just need documentation for the transfer." He was quiet. "What do you mean restructured?" he said. I explained it the way my lawyer had helped me explain it. Calmly, factually. The fund was still his. The money was still there. I just needed to verify how it was being used. He said he had to call me back. He called back 2 hours later. He did not sound like he was reading from a script this time. He sounded upset. He said Hazel thought this was incredibly controlling. He said I was making things difficult on purpose. He said he couldn't believe I was going to make him jump through hoops for his own graduation money. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Liam, the money is there. Send me the lease." "This is because of the dinner," he said. "This is you punishing us." "It isn't," I said. "This is me being careful with money, which is something I've been doing your whole life so that it would be there when you needed it. Send me the lease and I'll process the transfer within the week." He hung up. Hazel called 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 8 minutes long. I'm not going to repeat all of it because it's not really the point, but the part that stood out was near the end, where she said, "Liam has been patient with you for years, and you have never once respected that we are a family unit now and you are not the center of it." I played that part back twice. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the 9-year-old who used to sleep in my bed during thunderstorms because he was scared. I thought about the graduation night I wasn't at, in the restaurant I never saw. I thought about the thumbs up emoji. I didn't call back. What I did instead was write Liam a letter, an actual letter, on paper, the way his mother used to write things when she wanted them to matter. I told him that I loved him without condition. I told him that the money was still available and would remain available, and that I would transfer it the day he sent me the lease. I told him that I was not trying to control his life or punish him or make things difficult. I told him that I was 63 years old and that I had spent 40 of those years building something so that he would have more than I did, and that I was proud of who he was as an engineer and as a person, and that none of what was happening right now changed any of that. I also told him, as gently as I could, that I had made some changes to my estate planning that he should be aware of when the time came. Not as a threat, just as information. I mailed it to his old address in Waterloo, where I knew it would get forwarded to him. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. Then, on a Sunday morning in September, Liam called me at 7 a.m. His voice was different. "Queeter," he said. "I got your letter." I said, "Good." He said, "Dad, the job fell through." I sat up straighter. He said the offer had been rescinded due to a reorganization at the firm. It had happened fast. He said they were still planning to take the condo, but now they weren't sure they could swing it without the money from his father-in-law coming through. And that wasn't looking certain anymore either. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say I should have called sooner. But his voice was the voice I recognized, the one underneath all the other stuff. I said, "Send me the lease." He said, "I don't have it yet. We haven't signed." I said, "When you sign it, send it to me. I'll take care of the transfer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you being good to me right now?" And I said, "Because that's what fathers do." I heard him breathe. I said, "But Liam, we need to talk about some things. Not today. When you're ready." There are things I need to say to you and things I need you to hear, and I want us to do that properly, not over the phone." He said okay. He sent me the lease 3 weeks later. I processed the transfer the same day. It landed in his account by Thursday. He texted me, "Thank you, Dad." I texted back, "Dinner? Soon? I'll make the butter tarts." He said, "Yeah, I'd like that." We had dinner in October at my house in Cambridge. Hazel was not there. I didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd showed him my books when he was 16, and we talked for 3 hours. Some of it was hard. He said things that were painful to hear, and I said things that I don't think he'd wanted to face. And at some point near the end, he put his head in his hands and said he didn't know how he'd let so much distance grow between us. I told him distance grows when you're not paying attention, that it's not always anyone's fault, that what matters is whether you're willing to close it. I don't know what happens next with Hazel. That's their marriage, and it's not mine to sort out. I hope they figure it out. I genuinely do. What I know is this. I have a family trust that is still in my son's name. The conditions are still in place, and they'll stay there for now. Because I think for the moment they're the right ones. The graduation fund has been transferred. My accounts are my own. And on the second Sunday of November, my son came to Cambridge with a grocery bag, and we watched the Leafs lose in overtime together, the way we used to, and he fell asleep on my couch at halftime. And I put a blanket over him and turned the lamp off, and I stood there in my living room looking at my son, who is 30 years old and sometimes still looks 9 to me, and I thought, this is what I built it all for. Not the money, not the company, not the trust or the conditions or any of it. This.